Okay, we might as well get started. All right, I'm Bob, a compulsive overeater. I'm an alcoholic, and I want people to like me. So anyway, to get started, let's start on page 559. Does anybody, if you have your big book there, you could read along. But this pretty much, this is amazing because 559 is the last page in the big book. Isn't that amazing when you think about it, right? So we had to come, what it reminded me of, like people always say, and I had to say when I came into AA, OA, whatever compulsive 12-step program it was, that it was the last house on the block. So this is actually the last page in the book. We needed 600 pages to figure this all out, really, when we could have figured out in a moment just reading, the steps. But that's the way we are. We have all of these. We were talking earlier before the meeting started about all of these self-help books, and I have all of these books, and I always asked a million people how to solve my problem, but hopefully here, finally, we'll have what's called the solution on page 559. Although in this book, you'll find it on most all the pages, especially the first 167 pages. But on page 559, which is the last house on the block, which is the last page in the big book, it says, now we're going to find the solution here in this one page. It's not, this program is a simple program. But at the end of all the stories, they actually talk about the solution. But here on page 559, which is the last house on the block, which is the last page in the book, this is going to tell. So if you listen intently, we're going to have what's called the spiritual awakening. Step 12 says, as a result of these steps, and through this big book on the first 167 pages. But going through these books, there are some pages were pretty amazing. And the name of the topic today is how to handle sobriety and abstinence, because we're talking about food addiction, alcohol, drug addiction, but the name of the chapter is also how to handle sobriety. So how great is that? We have the last page in the book, and the name of it's called How to Handle Sobriety. Just to start with that topic, the reason I came in here was because I was miserable, irritable, and discontent. So I needed some. So anyway, let me reread. It all says it here on this page, 559 in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, and Overeaters Anonymous uses as a book also. So it says here, well, actually, I'll start on the very last sentence in 558. God willing, we members of AA, and I'll put in there also OA and NA, Narcotics Anonymous, and any other anonymous you want to put in there, never again have to deal with a drinking or overeating or compulsive eating in either direction, whether you eat a lot or you don't eat a lot, the same thing. Have to deal with sobriety every day. Every day we deal with sobriety. So how do we do it? So it's telling us here, look, this book always talks about the solution. It says, how do we do it? So if you're being upset or you're miserable or you're discontent, or you're depressed, it's telling you on page 559, which is the last block, house on the block, the last page in the big book, and how to handle sobriety is going to tell you how to do it. It says first by learning through practicing the 12 steps. That's what this whole program is about. It's called the 12-step program. People have been in it for years. It could be 10, 20, 30 years. I'm not sure they know it's a 12-step program. They could talk. It could be a group therapy. It could be a lot of other different things, but it's basically a 12-step program. And step 12 says promises that we'll have that spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, which I could tell you, people I notice in myself, it is really, really true. And then it says, how to cope with the problems that we look to booze and food and people and money and success to solve. We could never fill ourselves because we were looking for the answer in all the wrong places. As I always say on this meeting, the answer is in us. The bliss, the higher power, the joy, the happiness is inside of us. But we're always looking for the low-hanging fruit in the material society we live in. We always, that stuff that's out there, but it's only momentary pleasure. It can last a moment and that's it. Just like you have that food or that drink, it's a momentary thing, but it only makes it worse. More pleasure, the worse it is on the other side. With the maiming of the body, the addiction to the alcohol, the drugs, will kill us and we'll get really sick and unhealthy. And psychologically, these things cause all the depression, anxiety too. Whenever your alcohol depresses you and food has all that sugar and it's white powder, right? Sugar. And it's also the same thing, the white powder in cocaine and heroin, whatever you want to drug, the drug of your choice. So how to cope with the problems that we look to booze and food to solve back in our drinking and eating days. Okay. So, for example, we are told in AA that we cannot afford resentments and self-pity. So we learn to avoid these festering mental attitudes. So this is very important. And it's going to tell you how to get rid of it right here in this page as I was reading forward. But it's telling you the biggest problem we have is with people and situations in our life. That's the biggest problem we have. The resentment, the anger, the seven sins, right? As Bill writes about in page 48 in the 12 and 12, he says that envy, jealousy, it all has to do with our relationship with people. Okay, and it's going to explain it here, but we're going to also have the solution here. This is what's amazing. And some people could read this book and these stories a million times in the steps in the first part. But if you really listen with your heart and incorporate what it's saying here. So first thing it's saying is, number one, it's telling us that we have to avoid resentment, self-pity. So we learn to avoid these festering mental attitudes. So if we learn to avoid them, it's going to tell us how to do it right here. Page 559, the last page in the big book. Similarly, we rid ourselves of guilt and remorse as we clean out the garbage. Guilt and remorse, with our addictions, somebody, like even with everything in life, it's one thing if you say last night somebody had a lot of food or they got off their so-called diet program, and we all talk about that. But it's the resentment and guilt. Or say you said something to somebody and you were resentful and angry. It's the resentment and guilt that you hold. That's the root of the problem. But if we can have a different way of thinking, then no matter what happened in the past, if it was last night, if it, some people, I'm talking about last night. How many of you 30 years ago or 10 to 20 years ago are thinking about something that you said or somebody said to you? It says here, these are deadly. And again, it's going to tell us here how to get rid of this. I'm telling you, it's going to tell us here how to get rid of this on page 559. And then it says, clean out the garbage. Now, this is so important because some people don't really feel that this is garbage. They feel that it, a lot of people say, well, I got to work through my anger, work through my fear. I have to say, and some of you, a lot of you may not agree with me on this, I have to toss it out like a hot coal, man. I don't hold on to it like something from a hot stove. And the reason is, and I explained this last week or last meeting, was because it's on a false premise. You want to feel the anger, but the anger is coming from the ego, which is false. It's coming on a false premise that you're the center of the universe and we have to control life and everything. Step one says we were powerless. So when we work these steps and they're not about us, we don't need those false premises. Anytime you're back in the ego, that's false. The ego causes all the devastation, and it talks about the resentment, the anger, and the fear. And when we get rid of these, and it says here, when we toss these out and cast them out, we don't do it, but we get this higher consciousness, which was in us all the time, the real source of our real lives. When we do that, just everything opens up to us. But as soon as you're in your car, you're at work, or you're at home, and you have this resentment, you're just in this little place. And with the food and the alcohol, and I used to come home, it was just all about my best friend was the drinking, or my best friend was the food. How small do you want to live your life that way, be in prison? You're like in solitary confinement with the food or the alcohol or the drugs or the people. You can be free of this. I mean, right now, these steps said that spiritual awakening is rising above this. But anyway, it's going to tell us here how to do it. So let me read so we can get the spiritual awakening before the meeting's over. Okay, so similarly, we rid ourselves of guilt, remorse as we clean out the garbage from our minds through the fourth and fifth steps of the recovery program, through the fourth and fifth steps. Again, going back to the steps. It's all about the steps. I just want to say one thing, and I've said this in many meetings. A lot of people might say, oh, AA is a cult or something like that. These steps here are based on all the major Eastern, Western religions and philosophies, the ancient philosophies of the Greeks and so forth. All of these different philosophies, these men were desperate, the first 100 men, and what they did, they compiled all of this. When you read different things, different religions, or whatever it is, it all comes down to this spirituality, spiritual awakening. Because the whole problem was that people found philosophy and religions was us in our thinking. God gave us this intelligence to think on a higher level, but we misuse it like everything else good in our lives. We misuse it to figure things out, to have resentments and anger, because we have the ego from the higher thinking. Again, a child, or I always use an example of a puppy dog, wouldn't have those feelings because a child just goes out and enjoys life and plays. And a puppy dog is just, they say every day is the happiest day of their lives because they don't have this higher level of thinking. But we have it, and it's great that God gave it to us. We have this higher level, but we misuse it. The reason we have it is fear or fear-flight response. So if somebody is going to attack you or put a gun to your head, or you're in a wilderness, that's when we use it. But whoa, no, we use it every time somebody looks at us the wrong way. We think they said something about us, or even if they came to us and pushed our buttons. That's the way we run our lives.